They called it restructuring. I called it betrayal wrapped in corporate language. I remember that morning vividly. The soft hum of the espresso machine, the chatter of analysts in glass cubicles, and my own reflection in the office window. Calm, confident, completely unaware that my career was about to be stolen in a single email. For 6 years, I built that department from the ground up. Financial compliance, audit control, risk management, the backbone of the company. I had turned chaos into systems, leaks into reports, and rumors into data the board could trust. And yet, when the new CFO joined, everything shifted. He had that fake charm, the kind that smells like expensive cologne and hidden agendas. The kind of man who shakes your hand while calculating how soon he can take your chair. Within weeks, he began cutting costs and optimizing efficiency. At first, it was small things: a vendor contract renegotiated, an analyst laid off, an intern left unpaid. Then it got personal. My position was under review. They said my salary was too high for a function they could easily outsource. Imagine hearing that. Your years of sweat, loyalty, and expertise reduced to a spreadsheet formula. I smiled through the meeting, nodded politely, and even thanked them for the transparency. But inside I was shaking. Not with fear, with quiet, calculated fury. I knew what outsourcing meant. They'd ship my role to a third-party firm that would undercut costs and take over all our IRS reporting, tax compliance, and audit documentation. I was to train them during the transition. Basically, train my replacement. It wasn't just insulting. It was dangerous, because I knew something they didn't. Our compliance framework wasn't just fragile. It was deliberately manipulated. Over the years, I'd noticed how upper management had been reclassifying international payments, shifting tax credits, and hiding expense reports in subsidiaries. I had flagged them, written memos, even confronted the old CFO once. He brushed it off with a laugh. "You worry too much, Maya. Everyone plays a little loose with numbers." But loose wasn't the word. It was fraud, carefully disguised and quietly growing. And now the same system I had refused to manipulate was being handed over to a firm in another country that barely knew US tax law. I could already see it coming. Misfilings, misreports, red flags, and eventually, an IRS audit that would tear everything apart. That's when I made my decision. If they wanted to outsource my role, fine. I would let them. But I wouldn't leave quietly. I'd make sure their arrogance came back to haunt them. Not through sabotage, not through gossip, but through cold, undeniable truth. As I packed my things that evening, I looked around one last time at the office I had built. The glass walls, the polished floors, the empty smiles. Everyone thought I was done. They had no idea I was just getting started. They thought they were saving money. What they didn't realize was that they had just invited the IRS straight to their door. I didn't sleep that night. My mind kept replaying every decision, every file, every signature I had ever approved for that company. Numbers have always told me stories. And this one whispered of greed, deception, and carelessness dressed as innovation. When I joined Ventrix Global, it was a rising star in corporate finance. We handled high-value mergers and government-backed tax credits. My job was to keep everything clean, to ensure the numbers could survive any audit. But slowly over the years, I realized integrity was the one thing they didn't want me to protect. The first cracks appeared 2 years ago. A small discrepancy in a subsidiary's quarterly report. Nothing major. Just a missing $200K line item under operational consultancy. When I dug deeper, it turned out to be a personal trip the former CFO had disguised as a client development expense. I reported it internally, expecting it to be fixed. Instead, I was told to focus on bigger things. That was when I learned how this company truly worked. Mistakes weren't corrected, they were covered. Problems weren't solved, they were redirected. And the people who asked too many questions didn't last long. So I stopped fighting openly. I started documenting quietly, meticulously. Every approval, every transaction, every falsified deduction. Not to leak it, not yet, but because a part of me knew one day, truth might be the only leverage I'd have left. And now, that day had come. When HR called me in for the transition briefing, I wore my best smile. Across the table sat the CFO, Eric Lang, the man who replaced integrity with profit margins. He leaned back, smug, pretending this was just business. "You've done great work, Maya," he said smoothly. "But the board decided to partner with a specialized offshore team to streamline compliance. We'd like you to help them on board. Make sure everything runs smoothly before your departure." I nodded, pretending to agree. I could see right through his corporate tone. This wasn't cost-cutting. This was cleaning house. He wanted me gone before I could notice what he was doing behind the scenes. What he didn't realize was, I already had. That night, I accessed every file I still had credentials for. I downloaded nothing. I wasn't stupid. But I noted patterns. Duplicated invoices, layered shell accounts, and reclassified employee reimbursements that looked suspiciously like executive perks. They'd been moving taxable income offshore for months, disguising it through consulting shells. And the outsourcing firm they hired? I looked them up. Barely a year old, based in Manila. No US tax experience. Cheap, compliant, and conveniently disposable. The perfect front for a deeper cover-up. I realized then, my exit wasn't just personal. It was strategic. They wanted my name off the records before the fiscal year closed, so if anything went wrong, I'd be an easy scapegoat. So I began my plan. Quietly. Carefully. First, I made sure every remaining report had my signature and a timestamp that proved when it was completed, before the outsourcing began. Then, I scheduled one final compliance audit with an external consultant I trusted. Just to smooth the transition, I said. In reality, I was leaving a breadcrumb trail, one that led straight to the truth. And finally, I sent a polite farewell email to the team. It read like a goodbye, but hidden between the lines was my warning. May accuracy always guide your numbers. Only a few people understood what that meant. As I walked out of that building for the last time, I didn't feel defeated. I felt focused. They thought they'd buried me under paperwork and policies. But I knew something they didn't. The IRS doesn't ignore anomalies forever, and I had just made sure there'd be plenty for them to find. 2 weeks after my exit, the silence was deafening. No calls, no updates, not even a token farewell message from management. It was as if I'd been erased from existence. Exactly what Eric Lang wanted. I was supposed to disappear, leaving the outsourced team to handle everything. But I didn't disappear. I watched. I still had friends inside. Analysts who trusted me more than they trusted the new leadership. Late-night messages trickled in. The Manila team keeps asking for clarification. They messed up the tax bracket mapping. Eric's been pushing reports through without review. I could see it all unraveling in real time. Ventrix. Global had no idea the compliance structure I'd built. Wasn't just a formality, and it was a shield. It protected the company from its own greed, and now that shield was gone. The offshore firm had no clue about US reporting protocols or the delicate balancing act between federal deductions and state credits. They submitted reports late, duplicated entries, and missed cross-department reconciliations. Each mistake wasn't just sloppy, it was a red flag. Then came the real issue. My external consultant, the one I had scheduled before leaving, completed the final internal audit. And it didn't go to me this time. It went directly to the IRS compliance portal, as was standard for closing year audits. The report included every irregularity I had documented. Nothing illegal in what I did. Everything was procedural. But it meant that once the IRS cross-referenced those numbers with the next filings, they'd find everything. Within a month, the whispers started. My former team told me about unusual inquiries from the IRS. Ventrix Global was claiming tax credits for subsidiaries that didn't exist anymore. Overseas transactions weren't matching bank statements. Eric started holding closed-door meetings almost daily. The board was nervous. Still, they tried to blame the outsourced firm. I could almost hear the panic echoing down the hallways I once walked. They had replaced expertise with cheap labor, and were now buried in errors they couldn't even understand. Then, one night, my phone lit up with a message from Mia, one of the last analysts still loyal to me. "Maya, the IRS sent a preliminary notice. They're coming for a compliance review. Eric's freaking out." I sat there staring at the message. My heart wasn't racing. It was steady, cold, focused. The trap had been set, and they had walked right into it. But I wasn't celebrating yet. Because I knew how corporate politics worked, they'd try to shift the blame. And I had already anticipated that move. I had kept my name clear of any filings after my departure, with time-stamped reports showing exactly when I left. If they tried to involve me, I'd have evidence that I wasn't responsible for anything after that date. Still, part of me wanted to watch it all collapse from up close, so I called Mia. "Keep me updated," I said. "And if they start blaming anyone, make sure the documentation shows who approved what. Keep copies," she hesitated. "You think they'll actually get audited?" I smiled faintly. "They already are. They just don't know it yet." A week later it began. The IRS requested full documentation of Ventrix's tax filings, expense breakdowns, and subsidiary accounts. For a company as large as ours, that wasn't routine. That was an investigation. Eric tried to handle it quietly. He even brought in external lawyers and PR advisors. But once federal investigators entered the building, whispers turned into headlines. Ventrix Global under IRS scrutiny for financial misreporting. I watched the news from my apartment window, sipping coffee in silence. My reflection in the glass looked the same, calm, controlled. But inside, there was something deeper. Not joy. Not revenge, just closure slowly taking shape. They thought outsourcing me was saving them money. Now they were paying the price, with interest. When I first heard they were calling it a minor audit, I almost laughed. There's no such thing as a minor IRS audit. Not when the agency starts asking for internal communications, draft reports, and signatures from a 6-month window. That's not a review, that's a warning shot. Mia's messages became my window into the chaos. "They've sealed off the finance floor," she whispered during one late call. Eric's shredding paper like a man possessed. The legal team's camping in the conference room. Everyone's terrified. And then came the betrayal I'd been expecting. A week into the audit, my name appeared in an internal memo. Former compliance officer whose transition documentation may have contributed to filing errors. In other words, they were setting me up. Eric had crafted the narrative perfectly. The hardworking new CFO, blindsided by sloppy handovers from an overpaid manager who'd left without completing her responsibilities. It was clean, convenient, and believable to anyone who didn't know the truth. I could have ignored it. I was out. I had nothing to prove. But something about seeing my name used to protect the very people who dismantled my department made my blood run cold. I had spent years keeping that company lawful, and now they wanted to make me the face of its downfall. No, not this time. I pulled out the small encrypted flash drive I'd kept hidden in my desk for years. Not company data, just copies of my own work logs, memos, and approval emails. Everything tied to my user credentials, all time-stamped by the system. I had protected it not out of paranoia, but because I'd learned long ago that honesty means nothing without proof. I reached out to a contact at the IRS, a senior compliance officer named Helena who had once spoken at a corporate ethics seminar I attended. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't send documents. I just asked a question. Would it be helpful if someone familiar with Ventrix's internal compliance systems clarified how their audit trail works? Her reply came within an hour. Off the record? Yes, that was all I needed. Meanwhile, inside Ventrix, Eric's arrogance was rotting him from the inside out. He blamed the outsourced team publicly, screamed at the analysts privately, and held press conferences claiming full cooperation while trying to erase evidence overnight. But every deleted file left a trace. Every hidden transaction had a trail. Then came the real twist. Mia told me that Eric had secretly authorized backdated corrections to old filings, falsifying timestamps, to make it seem like the errors came before he took over. That's when I realized he wasn't just trying to survive the audit. He was trying to rewrite history. That was his fatal mistake. Because the IRS doesn't just check reports, they check access logs. And guess who had archived all the old login histories from my tenure? Me. Each file contained exact timestamps of when I'd closed my final reports and when the new accounts were created for the outsourcing firm. I forwarded those to Helena. Still no accusations. Still informational. Just data that clearly showed one thing. Every suspicious activity happened after my departure. A few days later, I saw it on the news. Ventrix Global's CFO under investigation for obstruction of federal audit. The board distanced themselves overnight, releasing a sterile statement about internal leadership issues. Eric was suspended pending review. But the damage was already done. Investors fled, partnerships collapsed, and the company's reputation began to sink like a stone in cold water. And yet, as satisfying as it was, part of me couldn't ignore the bitter irony. The very systems I built to protect the company were now being used to destroy it. That night, I sat in my apartment, lights dimmed, watching the skyline flicker. The betrayal had come full circle, theirs against me, and mine against the illusion I'd once believed in. They outsourced my role. They erased my name. And now, their empire was collapsing under the weight of its own deceit. I never liked fireworks. Mine would be paperwork, patience, and small, irreversible moves that looked accidental until they weren't. Revenge, I'd learned, is most effective when it's invisible at first. A patient virus that takes hold and then becomes undeniable. My plan had 3 pillars: legal accuracy, strategic timing, and public leverage. Nothing rash, no dramatic leaks that could be dismissed as vindictive. Just undeniable proof, delivered to the right places in the right order. First, I tightened the facts. I couldn't rely on rumor or emotion, nice only documents. I spent days rebuilding the timeline in my head and translating it into a living map. Approvals, timestamps, alternate accounts, and email threads. Mia and 2 trusted analysts sent me copies of internal messages and reconciliations they'd quietly archived. Every backdated correction Eric had authorized. Every offshore transfer that didn't match bank reconciliations. Every consulting invoice with the same P.O. box. I cross-checked each item against public filings and wire confirmations. The pattern was ugly, and it was coherent. Second, I fortified the legal angle. I had already been careful to keep my own hands clean, but I needed professional firepower that could withstand corporate counsels and PR spin. I reached out to Helena at the IRS one more time and asked if she would recommend a forensic accounting firm that could present evidence precisely and immovably. She gave me 2 names and a nod. Make it airtight, make it procedural. I hired the best of the 2 under a consulting arrangement, not to take down anyone, but to prepare a forensic report that regulators, the board, and eventually the public could not ignore. Third, I created leverage without theatrics. Public outrage can topple empires, but it must be precise. I prepared a phased release. Regulators first, then shareholders, then, only if necessary, the press. The first target was the board and the audit committee. If the forensic report showed deliberate misstatements and backdating, the board would be forced into action. Forced resignations, emergency shareholder notices, an independent review. The second lever was investors. Big institutional partners hate uncertainty. The moment they smelled fraud, their withdrawal would amplify pressure from inside. The press was the final amplifier, not the starter. There were risks. If I moved too quickly, Eric would hide more. If I moved too slowly, documents could be altered. So timing mattered. I instructed Mia to keep feeding me daily snapshots of the offshore team's submissions and the legal team's communications. I asked my forensic firm to focus on a narrow window, the 2 quarters around my departure and the immediate months after. Narrow was better. It prevented defenders from claiming scope creep. I also prepared a counter-narrative. Eric would claim he was the victim of sloppy handovers. I anticipated that, which is why every one of my archived memos, time-stamped approvals, and my exit audit trail were organized in a way the forensic team could present them as a clear chain of custody. If he tried to rewrite history, the logs would show when entries were created, who accessed them, and where the anomalies began. The digital breadcrumbs were merciless. There was one more move, the quietest, and the one I trusted least to my own hands. I reached out to an old acquaintance, a corporate governance lawyer who had a reputation for being ruthlessly discreet. I handed her a sealed packet containing copies of the forensic report, the timeline, and a request. Prepare a shareholder motion and a legal notice to the audit committee to be filed if the board didn't act within 48 hours of receiving the report. Legal pressure, when combined with credible forensic evidence, would force their hand without me having to tweet a single accusation. I didn't tell Mia everything. Not yet. She had enough on her plate keeping the internal engine running while the IRS did its work. but I told her the part she needed to believe. When we moved, we would move in a way that left no plausible alternative narrative. No whispers. No blame games. Just cold facts, assembled by experts, presented to the people whose jobs depended on truth. On the evening before the forensic report was delivered, I stood on my apartment balcony and watched the city lights blur. I felt no triumph, only a strange clarity. Revenge had never been about cruelty for me. It was about balance, exposing a wrong, and forcing a reckoning that the company had tried to avoid. I hit send on the secure file transfer to Helena at midnight, then I waited for the first answer. The first tremor came quietly, a notice to the board titled, "Urgent Compliance Findings, Immediate Action Required." The forensic report had landed, and with it, the beginning of the end. Within hours, it started to spread. The audit committee convened an emergency meeting. Legal counsel was summoned, and by dawn, the whispers I had waited months to hear finally began to echo through the glass towers of Ventrix Global. Maya texted me first. "They're panicking. Board called an unscheduled closed session. Eric hasn't come out of his office all morning." By noon, another message. "Someone leaked the report to internal compliance. People are reading it like wildfire." I stayed still, silent, almost detached. I wasn't part of this world anymore. I was just watching gravity reclaim what arrogance had suspended. The report was everything I'd planned for. It detailed every backdated correction, every misclassified transaction, every false deduction. The timestamps aligned perfectly. All the fraudulent adjustments happened after my final day. The forensic summary ended with a single sentence that landed like a blade. "Preliminary findings suggest deliberate alteration of compliance data post-transition with intent to misrepresent corporate tax obligations." That line alone was enough to trigger a full-blown federal investigation. By midweek, the IRS sent a formal inquiry notice to Ventrix's board. Simultaneously, investors started withdrawing. A major shareholder froze funding. Employees began updating their resumes. The house of cards was trembling. And then came the inevitable public exposure. A financial news outlet picked up whispers of the internal audit. Within hours, headlines spread across digital feeds. Ventrix Global under federal investigation for tax misconduct. The company's stock plummeted 17% in a single day. The same executives who had once lectured me about cost efficiency were now holding frantic press conferences to reaffirm transparency, but it was too late. The board had turned on Eric. They needed a scapegoat, and he had made himself too visible. When the audit committee confronted him with timestamp evidence contradicting his statements, he reportedly lost control, shouting, blaming, denying. HR escorted him out of the building before sunset. For the first time, I allowed myself to breathe. The man who had erased me from my own department was now erased, from the company entirely. But the climax wasn't just about his fall, and it was about the reckoning that followed. The IRS expanded its probe to include the board's awareness of the misconduct. The forensic firm's findings were now part of a larger compliance review. Every corner of Ventrix's operations was under scrutiny: offshore accounts, expense claims, vendor chains. The same system they had manipulated was now devouring them, line by line. One evening, Mia called, her voice shaking between disbelief and relief. "They found the fake subsidiaries, Maya. The ones Eric used for tax credits. They're freezing accounts. The IRS is inside the building." For a moment I didn't answer. I just listened. The sound of justice arriving not with sirens, but with spreadsheets and silence. When the government's preliminary report became public, one paragraph stood out. "Key compliance structures established under former officer Maya Rahman were found to be intact and accurate prior to transition. Subsequent deviations appear intentional." My name, the one they had tried to bury, was now printed as the benchmark of integrity. The irony was poetic. I walked to my desk, opened the envelope containing my original resignation letter, and smiled faintly. I had written it calmly back then, with no bitterness, no accusations, just one line at the end that now felt prophetic. Numbers don't lie. People do. And now, the numbers had spoken for me. Ventrix Global was collapsing, not because I fought back, but because truth doesn't stay buried forever. It only waits for the right moment to surface. And when it does, it takes everything false with it. By the end of that quarter, Ventrix Global was a shell of what it once was. The board dissolved half its leadership. Investors pulled out of pending deals. And the company's reputation in the finance world turned radioactive overnight. The final IRS report confirmed what I'd known all along: deliberate falsification, hidden transfers, and a calculated attempt to shift blame. The penalties were brutal. Multi-million-dollar fines, revoked licenses for key executives, and a mandatory restructuring under federal supervision. I watched it unfold from a distance, detached yet deeply aware of the symmetry. The same glass building where I once stood defending integrity was now filled with investigators auditing every line I'd ever tried to protect. Mia left the company soon after. So did most of the honest ones. She called me one evening, her voice quiet but relieved. "You did it, Maya. You really did it." I smiled softly. "No," I said. "The truth did." Still, part of me grieved. Not for the people who betrayed me, but for the company I had believed in before ambition poisoned it. For the late nights spent perfecting reports that would never be remembered. For the version of myself that once thought loyalty was enough. Justice doesn't heal you. It just restores balance. Weeks later, I received an anonymous letter. No sender. Just a single typed line. "We should have listened." I folded it neatly, slipped it into my journal, and closed it. That chapter was over. As I walked out onto the balcony, the city lights looked different. Not brighter, not darker, just honest. I realized revenge had never been about destruction. It was about revelation. They outsourced my role, thinking I was expendable. But truth never gets outsourced. It just waits. Patient, precise, for the liars to sign their own undoing. Looking back, I don't see revenge, I see accountability. What they called betrayal was simply the mirror reflecting their own deceit. I didn't destroy Ventrix Global. I just removed the silence that kept it standing. The truth doesn't shout, it waits. And when it finally speaks, it does so with evidence, not anger. In the end, I learned that power built on lies always collapses under its own weight. All it takes is one honest person refusing to look away. They outsourced my role, but not my integrity. That remained. Unbought. Unbroken. Undeniable. This is Revenge Untold, where every fall begins with a choice, and every truth finds its voice.